The Making of an Elizabethan Mind, a Classical Curriculum. Lecture 4, Terence, the Stage and the Art of Not Being Caught. At the end of our last lecture, I promised you the prologues, and I intend to deliver them. But I want to begin somewhere slightly unexpected, because it illuminates everything that follows. I want to begin with an empty theater. It is 165 before the Christian era. The occasion is the funeral games of Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the general who destroyed the Macedonian kingdom at the Battle of Pydna 3 years earlier. These are public games on a considerable scale, and they include theatrical performances, which is the occasion for which Terence has written his second play, the Hysira, the mother-in-law. The audience assembles. The prologue is spoken. The play begins. And then, somewhere in the middle of the first act, the audience gets up and leaves, not in ones and twos, en masse, because a rumor has spread through the crowd that there are gladiators performing somewhere else, and the audience has collectively decided that a comedy about domestic misunderstanding is not an adequate substitute for men trying to kill each other. The play was abandoned. Terence tried again. At another festival, the same thing happened. A rumor of a tightrope walker. This time the audience left. The play was abandoned again. He finally got it performed, the complete, at a third attempt, and he wrote about the experience in the prologue to that third performance, with a restraint that is, by any measure, heroic. He does not rage. He does not weep. He observes that the theater is a difficult environment, that the audience is sovereign, and that a playwright who cannot survive the indifference of his audience is perhaps in the wrong profession. And then he asks quietly for silence, just silence, so that the play might be heard. I tell you this story because it reframes Terence entirely. We speak of him as the schoolmaster's ideal, the perfectly pellucid Latin stylist, the foundation of the grammar school curriculum. All of that is true. But he was also a working playwright trying to get his plays in front of an audience that would quite genuinely rather watch something else, operating in an environment where failure was public, immediate, and unambiguous. The gladiators were not a metaphor. They were an actual alternative 50 yards away, and they were winning. This matters because it explains something about the prologues that is otherwise puzzling. Terence uses his prologues not for the purpose that prologues conventionally serve, which is to tell the audience what they are about to see and put them in the right frame of mind. He uses them to argue, to defend himself against accusations, to attack his critics, to make the case for his own work with a directness that occasionally tips into something that looks rather like desperation. The man who writes with such perfect equilibrium in his plays is in his prologues plainly rattled. And the combination, the serene dramatic surface and the embattled authorial voice underneath it, is one of the most interesting things about him. The accusations he's defending himself against are worth examining because they tell us about the theatrical culture he was operating in. We have already mentioned the plagiarism charge. The suggestion that Scipio and Laelius were the real authors. Terence's response to this, as I noted, is essentially to say that he considers it a compliment and move on. But there are other charges. A rival playwright named Lucius Lanuvinus accused Terence of contaminatio, of ruining good Greek originals by combining them irresponsibly. Terence's response to this is interesting. He does not deny combining plots. He argues that combination done well is a legitimate artistic choice, that taking two mediocre scenes from different originals and making one excellent scene from them is not contamination, but improvement. This is a real critical argument, not a mere defense, and it is incidentally a perfect description of how Shakespeare worked. Because this is the moment to make explicit something that has been implicit since the beginning of the course. Shakespeare's method of composition was almost exactly analogous to the contaminatio that Terence both practiced and defended. He took existing stories, existing plays, existing historical accounts, combined them, altered them, added and removed characters, shifted emphasis, and produced from his contaminated materials something that felt entirely original. He learned this in part from Terence, not because anyone told him to learn it, because he had read the prologues as carefully as the plays, and he understood that Terence was describing a compositional method as well as defending it. Now let us go into the plays themselves, and let us begin with the characters who actually run them, not the fathers who provide the moral architecture, not the sons who provide the emotional energy, the slaves. The clever slave, the Servus Calidus, is one of the great recurring figures of Roman comedy. He predates Terence, appearing in the rougher, more boisterous comedies of Plautus, where he tends to be broader, louder, more explicitly triumphant in his manipulations. In Plautus, the clever slave is something of a hero. He outsmarts his social superiors, engineers the happy ending through a series of increasingly audacious deceptions, and takes considerable pleasure in his own ingenuity. The audience is invited to admire him straightforwardly. Terence is more complicated. His clever slaves are quieter, more anxious, less obviously celebratory about their own cleverness. The reason is not hard to find. In Terence, the stakes are more visible. A slave who constructs a deception that fails does not simply lose the game. He is beaten, sometimes severely, and the plays are not entirely coy about this possibility. Terence's slave characters carry with them an awareness of their own vulnerability that Plautus's tend not to. They are clever because they have to be. The ingenuity is not a game. It is a survival skill. This was not lost on the Elizabethan reader. The grammar school boy construing Terence's Latin was also, in a sense, being schooled in a social reality. The clever man in a world structured by power does not prosper by confronting that power directly. He works around it. He finds the gap between what the powerful man intends and what he has actually said, between what the social structure demands and what it can actually enforce. He is endlessly observant, endlessly adaptable, and he never, if he is wise, allows his superiors to feel that they have been managed. This is one note. Also an excellent description of how a successful Elizabethan courtier operated. The distance between Terence's clever slave and a man navigating the court of Elizabeth Tudor is one of social position. The underlying skill set is remarkably similar. Burghley understood this. Whether Essex did is, as we have observed, a question with a known answer. Let me take you to a specific scene in the Andria, the first play, the one that was performed at the Ludi Megalenses in 166 and launched Terence's career. The setup is this. Simo, a wealthy Athenian citizen, has arranged a marriage for his son Pamphilus. Pamphilus is in love with a woman named Glycerium, who is of uncertain social status and therefore unsuitable. Simo suspects this but has not been told directly. He wants to know the truth, and he is questioning his slave Davus about it. Davus knows everything. He knows about Glycerium. He knows Pamphilus is in love with her and has no intention of going through with the arranged marriage. And he must now decide what to tell Simo. He decides, for reasons he convinces himself are strategic, but which are also, Terence implies, a product of his own enjoyment of the situation, to tell Simo almost nothing while appearing to tell him a great deal. He is helpful, attentive, appropriately concerned, and entirely uninformative. Simo comes away from the conversation more suspicious than before, and with no useful additional information. Davus comes away having told no explicit lies, having technically fulfilled his obligations as a household slave, and having bought his young master some time. The scene is written in perfectly ordinary Latin. It is a model of grammatical clarity, and it is also a masterclass in the analysis of a conversation, as a power negotiation in which every sentence is simultaneously its surface meaning and a strategic move. The Elizabethan boy, passing it for his Latin lesson, was, without being told so, learning to read human interaction as a system of competing interests disguised as ordinary speech. This is not a small thing to learn. It is in fact close to the center of what a rhetorical education was for. I want to turn now to the play that, of all Terence's six, perhaps had the most direct influence on the Elizabethan theatrical imagination. The Eunuchus. The Eunuch. This is Terence's most popular play in antiquity, the one that earned him his largest fee, the one that was most frequently performed and most widely read. It is also the play that a modern reader comes to with the most complicated feeling. And I raise it not to dwell on those complications, which would be to fall into exactly the error I warned against at the beginning of this course, but because the play's central mechanism is one that Shakespeare returned to repeatedly, and understanding where it comes from illuminates what Shakespeare does with it. The mechanism is disguise. A young man named Career, infatuated with a girl named Pamphila, gains access to her household by disguising himself as a eunuch slave recently purchased as a gift. What follows is a comedy of mistaken identity, discovered deception, and the negotiation of its consequence. The play ends in a resolution that satisfied ancient audiences completely, and that later periods have found more equivocal. But what matters for our purposes is not the resolution, it is the device. Disguise as a mechanism for penetrating a social world that is otherwise closed to you. The adoption of a role that allows you access to spaces and relationships that your actual identity would prohibit. The discovery and its aftermath, which is always in Terence the most interesting part, because it is where the question of what people actually want beneath what they have been performing gets answered. These are structural elements that run through Shakespeare's comedies like a spine. The disguised Viola in Twelfth Night, the cross-dressed Rosalind in As You Like It, the bed-tricksome substitutions of the problem plays. The theatrical device is ancient. The use Shakespeare makes of it is entirely his own, but he found it in Terence. And he found in Terence's handling of it the crucial insight that disguise is not merely a plot mechanism. It is a way of asking what a person actually is beneath the roles that society has assigned them. The Elizabethan boy reading the Eunuchus was not, of course, expected to think about any of this. He was expected to identify the subjunctives and pass the indirect statements. But the questions were there in the text, patient and permanent, waiting for a mind that was ready for them. The grammar school planted them. The theater, 20 years later, brought them into flower. One final thing about Terence before we leave him, and it concerns a quality in his writing that the ancient critics named and that the Renaissance prized above almost everything else he did. It is what Cicero called his pure speech, sermo purus, the idea that good Latin is not Latin that shows its learning, not Latin that makes you aware of how carefully it has been constructed, but Latin that achieves its effects so completely that the construction becomes invisible. You simply understand. The words seem not to have been chosen, but to have arrived. This is in literary criticism one of the most demanding standards imaginable. It is far easier to write impressively than to write pellucidly. Impressiveness draws attention to itself. Pellucidity effaces itself entirely in the service of meaning, and the reason the schoolmasters were right to give Terence to the boys first, before Cicero's magnificent architectures and Virgil's overwhelming music, is that Terence teaches you what language is actually for, before the great stylists teach you what it can do. He teaches you that the goal is not the sentence. The goal is the thought the sentence carries. Everything else is, however, splendid in service of that. Shakespeare learned this too. His plainest lines are often his most devastating. When Lear says, "She's gone forever," that is sermo purus. When Prospero says, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on," the grandeur is in the simplicity. The ornament serves the thought rather than replacing it. That is Terence. That is the lesson the 11-year-old boy in the cold room was being given, in the only way it can be given, which is through the relentless practice of reading language that does the thing itself. In our next lecture, we make a significant move. We leave comedy behind and enter the world of the Roman Republic at the moment of its greatest crisis. We meet a man who is at the center of that crisis, who understood it better than almost anyone alive, who described it in prose of extraordinary brilliance, and who was killed for it. Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator Rome produced, quite possibly the greatest prose writer Latin has ever had, and a man whose life and death raised questions about duty, courage, and the limits of political intelligence that the Elizabethans found, for reasons that were not entirely comfortable, urgently relevant to their own situation. End of lecture 4.